The woman who appeared at Elias Thorne's door that night had walked 12 miles through freezing rain with a split lip and no coat. And the first thing she said was not "help me," but "is your barn dry?" Elias stood in the doorway with a lantern in one hand and nothing in the other, because a man who lives alone has no reason to keep a weapon at the door. She was tall, broad through the shoulders, somewhere past 35. Her hair was plastered dark against her skull. Her cotton dress was wrong for the season, wrong for the weather, wrong for the Cascade foothills in October. She was shivering, but she was standing the way a person stands when they have decided that shaking is something the body does and has nothing to do with the will. "Got caught in it," she said, nodding toward the ridge. "Been walking since afternoon." "The barn's dry," Elias said. "But there's a fire in here." She looked past him. One room, one chair at the table, one plate on the shelf. She took it in the way a woman measures a room when she is calculating not comfort but safety. "I'd prefer the barn," she said. "If it's all the same." It was not all the same. Nobody walks 12 miles in freezing rain to sleep in a barn when there is a warm fire 10 feet away. But Elias had lived alone long enough to know that a man does not question another person's need for walls between themselves and the world. "Barn's around back," he said. "I'll get you a blanket." He brought her 2 wool blankets and a lantern. She took them with a nod and nothing else. No name, no story. He watched her disappear around the side of the cabin, and he stood in the doorway for a long time after she was gone, listening to the rain on the cedar shake roof and the wind in the firs and something else, some instinct tugging at the back of his neck like a thread. Before we settle in, wherever you're listening from tonight, drop it in the comments. We like knowing who's with us when the fire's lit and the story's just beginning. Elias went back inside. He banked the fire. He lay down on the bedroll. He did not sleep. The cabin had been built for 3. He had cut the timber himself, squared every log, notched every corner, hung the door on iron hinges he'd carried 18 miles from the mill. He had built it the year his wife was alive and his daughter was growing. And there was a room off the back that had never been furnished and a loft that had never been slept in. He had put the other 2 plates away the week he buried them, and he had not taken them down since. He was almost asleep when he heard it. Not the wind, not an animal, a sound he had not heard in 5 years, a sound so small and so specific that it bypassed every wall he had built and went straight to the part of him that had been a father. A child's voice, faint, coming from the barn. He sat up. He listened. The sound did not come again. He told himself it was the wind. He lay back down. He did not sleep again. Dawn came gray and cold. The rain had turned to sleet overnight, and the trees were coated in ice that cracked and rang when the wind moved through them. Elias went to the barn. The blankets were folded neatly on a bale of straw. She was gone, but the straw had been disturbed. There were indentations in it, not one, but several. And on the floor, near the back wall, half hidden under a feed sack, there was a small leather shoe. It could not have fit a foot longer than 6 inches. He picked it up. He turned it over. The leather was worn thin and the sole was cracked. It was a child's shoe, patched twice with thread that did not match. He went to find the woman. She was behind the cabin, at the edge of the tree line, looking west down the ridge. She had washed her face in the creek, and in the gray morning light, the split lip looked worse than it had the night before. It was swollen and dark. It was not the kind of injury that came from a fall. It was the kind that came from a hand. She turned when she heard him. She saw what he was carrying. Her face changed, not to fear, but to something harder. The look of a person who has been found out and is deciding in that instant whether to run or to stand. He held up the shoe. "How many?" he said. She did not answer. "How many children are in my barn?" She told him on the walk back. 3. A boy of 8 named Samuel, a girl of 6 named Lily, and a boy of 3 named Jonah, who had not spoken in weeks and might not speak again. She opened the barn door. Elias looked inside. The children were in the far corner, nested together in the straw like pups. Samuel was sitting up, his body between the door and the 2 smaller ones. His eyes were hard and they were old. They were the eyes of a child who has learned that adults are not to be trusted and has been given no reason to change his mind. Lily was curled against his side, watching Elias with the wary stillness of a wild animal deciding whether to bolt. Jonah was asleep. He was so thin that Elias could see the architecture of his ribs through the shirt that hung off him like a sack. His skin had the gray, waxy look of a child who has been underfed for a long time, and his hands were curled into fists even in sleep, as if he was holding on to something that was not there. Elias stood in the doorway for a long time. The boy spoke first. His voice was flat, and it did not waver. "We won't stay long," he said. "We'll go today?" "No," Elias said. "You won't." He went to the cabin and came back with a pot of broth and bread and a cup of milk. He set it on the straw. He stepped back. He did not hover, because a man who has learned to handle horses knows that hovering is the fastest way to make a frightened creature bolt. The woman, Cora Maddox, she said her name was, told him the rest while the children ate. She told it in pieces, the way a person tells a story when the pieces are sharp. She had been a cook, 3 years at a place called Garrett's Foundling Home, a working farm 60 miles east in the Yakima Valley foothills. It was one of a dozen such places that had sprung up after the hard winter, the winter of 86 and 87, the one they called the Great Die-Up, when the cattle died by the thousands and the families who owned them died slower and in different ways. And the children were left. Silas Garrett took them in. The word people used was charity. It was not charity. Garrett ran a labor farm. He acquired orphans the way a man acquires livestock, cheap, in quantity, with an eye toward what they could produce. The children worked his fields and his timber. They were fed enough to stay upright. They were clothed enough to avoid attention. And when they got too sick to work, they were put in a room behind the barn and they were not visited. And when the room was emptied, it was not discussed. "I was the cook," Cora said. She was sitting on a bale of straw, and the children had finished eating, and Samuel was watching her with eyes that did not soften. Nobody watches the cook. A cook is furniture. That was my advantage for 3 years. "What happened?" Elias said. "I tried to go to the sheriff in Ellensburg. He told me Garrett was a pillar of the community." She paused. "The sheriff eats at Garrett's table every second Sunday. I served them both the same roast." "Why these 3? Elias was looking at Jonah, who had woken and was staring at nothing. They wouldn't have made the winter. Jonah's been sick since August. Lily stopped growing. Samuel hasn't had a full meal in months. And you just walked out. I waited until Garrett went to Ellensburg for supplies. I took what food I could carry. I took the children." She reached into her satchel and pulled out a leather-bound book, small, water-stained, the pages tight with handwriting. "And I took his ledger. Every child he took in. Every payment he received for their labor. Every child who died in that back room and where they were buried. And every dollar he paid the sheriff to look the other way." Elias took the ledger. He opened it. He read one page. He closed it. His jaw was tight, and the tendons in his neck stood out like cables. "You could have looked the other way," he said. "Most people would have. Most people did. For 3 years, most people did. The law was 3 days east. The children were dying today. I chose today." Elias sat on the porch that afternoon and watched the children in the yard, not playing, but existing with the careful, joyless caution of animals who have been caged and are not yet sure the cage is gone. Lily had found a stick and was drawing in the dirt. Samuel watched the road. Jonah sat in the sun, which was something, because for 3 days he had flinched from light the way a person flinches from a hand. The nearest settlement was a milling camp called Pine Hollow, 8 miles west. Elias knew them by sight and none by name, because that was the way he wanted it. If anyone saw children at his cabin, there would be talk. And if Garrett came looking, the talk would lead him here. Elias knew all of this. He sat on the porch and he knew it. And he watched Lily draw a house in the dirt with her stick, a square with a triangle on top, the way every child draws a house, and he made his choice. He went inside. He moved the 2 plates off the high shelf. He set them on the table. He swept out the back room. He brought blankets and made a bed. Cora was standing in the doorway, holding Jonah on her hip. The child had let her pick him up for the first time, and she was watching him. "They can stay in the back room," he said. "You take the bedroll by the fire. I'll sleep in the barn." "Why?" she said. "Not why can they stay. Why are you doing this at all?" Elias looked at the child on her hip, who was watching him with those great dark eyes. A man who turns away children in a storm doesn't get to call himself a man. "I stopped being a lot of things these past years. I wasn't ready to stop being that." She nodded. She did not thank him. She understood, the way one person who has been alone too long understands another, that gratitude can feel like a debt, and a debt can feel like a chain. What would you have done in her place? Would you have trusted a stranger in the mountains, a man you'd known for less than a day, with 3 children who weren't yours by blood, but were yours by choice? Leave a comment. We read every one. The morning of the second day broke clear. The storm had moved east, and the sky was the hard, clean blue that comes after a mountain storm, the kind of sky that makes everything visible for miles. Elias stepped outside at dawn, and his heart sank, because perfect visibility meant anyone on the valley road could see his chimney smoke. He was standing on the porch when he saw the dust. Far off, 3, maybe 4 miles. 5 riders, moving at a canter, coming up the ridge. "Cora," he said, "take the children to the barn. Now." She gathered them the way a mother gathers them when the house is on fire, one under each arm and the third by the hand. And she was across the yard before Elias had finished lacing his boots. 5 riders came up the switchback, for were rough men in work clothes, armed with rifles and sidearms, the kind of men who are paid to do what others don't want to do. The 5th was different. Silas Garrett rode at the front. He was a big man, thick through the chest, with a clean-shaved face and a wool coat too good for the road. He sat his horse the way a man sits when he has never been told to get down. His eyes were pale, and they moved over the landscape the way a buyer's eyes move over a herd, appraising, finding the flaw. He reined up and looked at Elias on the porch. He smiled. It was a practiced smile, designed to put people at ease and having the opposite effect on anyone who has learned to read faces. "Mr. Thorne," he said, "I understand you had a visitor. A woman. Traveling with inventory." Elias said nothing. "I'm Silas Garrett. I run a children's home east of here. The woman who came to your door was an employee. She left without notice and took 3 children. I'm here to bring them home." "She's not here," Elias said. Garrett's smile thinned. "Mr. Thorne, those children are in my care. I have documents. I have the support of the sheriff in Ellensburg. I'm prepared to compensate you. $20 for the information. $50 for the children." "No," Elias said. Garrett's smile disappeared. "This is not a negotiation. This is a retrieval." Elias stepped off the porch. He did not reach for a weapon. He did not raise his voice. He stood in the yard and looked at Silas Garrett the way a man looks at something he has already measured and found smaller than it thinks it is. "I know what your foundling home is," Elias said. "I know what you feed those children and what happens in the room behind your barn. And I know about the ledger." The air changed. Garrett's pale eyes went flat. "You don't know anything," Garrett said. "I know enough to hang you," Elias said. And there was something in his voice now that had not been there before, a weight that did not come from anger, but from authority. The kind of authority that comes from having stood in a federal courtroom and spoken words that sent men to prison. One of Garrett's men shifted in his saddle. He was younger than the others, and he was staring at Elias with recognition. "Thorne," the young man said. "You were a marshal." Garrett turned. "What?" "Deputy U.S. Marshal," the young man said. "I was in the courtroom in Olympia. 3 years ago. You put away Hardro's whole crew." He swallowed. "I thought you were dead." "I'm not dead," Elias said. He was looking at Garrett. "And I'm not a marshal anymore. But I was. And I know what a federal charge looks like. And I know what a territorial judge does to a man who runs a child labor farm and bribes a sheriff and buries children in unmarked graves." Garrett's face went white. Not with fear. Garrett was not a man who frightened easily, but with the recognition that the ground beneath him had shifted. He had come for 3 children and a cook, and found a former federal officer with evidence of his crimes. "Give me the children," Garrett said, and his voice was different now. The smoothness was gone. What was left was the raw, ugly sound of a man who has always gotten what he wants and is being told no. "Give me what's mine." "They're not yours," Elias said. One of Garrett's men dismounted and walked toward the barn. His hand was on his sidearm. He moved with the casual confidence of a man who is used to taking things from people who cannot stop him. Elias moved. He caught the man's wrist as the hand cleared the holster, twisted it behind his back, and put him face down in the mud with a knee between his shoulder blades. He had the man's pistol in his own hand before the man's cheek hit the ground. He did it in less than 3 seconds, and he did it without changing his breathing. The yard went still. Garrett drew his pistol. He pointed it at Elias. "You're not a marshal anymore," Garrett said. "You're a lumberjack. I will put a bullet in you and claim self-defense, and who is going to say otherwise?" Elias did not flinch. He had been here before. The moment when everything hangs on who blinks first, and the man across from you is betting that you care more about living than about what's right. He had stopped caring about living the day he buried his wife and daughter, and what was left instead was something more dangerous than a death wish. It was the absolute conviction that some things matter more than survival. "Shoot me," Elias said. "Shoot a former federal marshal on his own land in front of 4 witnesses. See what happens to you before the week is out." Garrett's hand was shaking. "Not much, but enough." The young rider pulled his horse back. "I'm not part of this. I didn't sign up to kill a lawman." He turned his horse and rode down the ridge. 2 of the other men looked at each other. They looked at Elias, standing with the same calm expression he'd had when he was carving breakfast that morning. Garrett lowered the pistol. He held it at his side, and his jaw was working and his eyes were burning with the cold fury of a man who is already planning his next move. 2 days, Garrett said. "I'll be back with the sheriff and a warrant. You can explain to a judge why you're harboring stolen children." He mounted up. "Enjoy your mountain, Mr. Thorne. It's the last place you'll enjoy for a long time." He rode out. His men followed, dragging the one from the mud. The dust settled and the clearing was quiet, and Elias stood in the yard with a stolen pistol in his hand and the taste of iron in his mouth, and he waited until the last sound was gone before he let out the breath he had been holding. The barn door opened. Cora was standing inside with the children behind her, and her face was white and her hands were shaking, and she had heard everything. "He's coming back," she said. "In 2 days. With a corrupt sheriff and a warrant. Then we run." "No," Elias said. "We don't run." He went into the cabin and came back with a cloth and a basin of water, and he sat on the porch step and began to clean the mud and blood from his knuckles. The skin was split across 2 of them. The man he'd taken down had been wearing a ring, and the water turned pink as he worked. Cora sat beside him. She took the cloth from his hands. She did not ask permission. She took his hand in hers. Her hands were large and steady and warm, and she began to clean the wounds with the careful efficiency of a woman who has tended injuries before and does not flinch at blood. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why it matters." The children came out of the barn one by one. Samuel first, scanning the yard. Then Lily, holding a piece of straw she had woven into something that might have been a bird. Then Jonah, blinking at the light. Lily went to Elias. She stood in front of him and looked at his bloody knuckles and held out the woven straw. It was a bird. It was crude and lopsided, and it was unmistakably a bird. "For you," she said. It was the first thing she had said to him. Elias took it. He held it in his clean hand, and he looked at it for a long time, and something moved in his face that was not visible to anyone who did not know what to look for. But Cora saw it because she was holding his other hand, and she felt the tension leave his fingers the way air leaves a bellows. He went inside. He was in there for a while. When he came out, he was carrying something small, made of pine. A bird, carved with a skill that comes from love and practice and the particular patience of a man who has spent 5 years with nothing to do but cut wood and remember. He had made it for his daughter. The week before the fever took her, she had held it the whole last night. He held it out to Lily. She looked at it. She looked at him. She took it and held it against her chest. She did not say thank you, because children who have learned that gifts come with prices do not say thank you. They hold on. That evening, the children slept in the cabin for the first time. Lily and Jonah in the back room. Samuel on the floor near the door, because he would not sleep with his back to an entrance. Cora took the bedroll by the fire. Elias sat on the porch with the stars overhead and the mountains around him like the walls of a world he had built to keep everything out. Cora came out and sat beside him. The night was cold and clear, and the smoke from the chimney rose straight up into the dark. "I was a marshal," he said. It was the first time he had said it in 5 years. "Deputy U.S. Marshal, Washington Territory. I served under Judge Harlan Watts in Olympia. I put away men who did what Garrett does." "What happened?" "I was on a manhunt. 3 weeks, up in the Okanagan. I got them all. I rode home, and my wife and my daughter were dead. Fever. 2 days, start to finish." He was quiet for a long time. A coyote called from the ridge, high and thin and lonesome. I wasn't there. I was 3 weeks away, chasing horse thieves, while my wife boiled water for compresses until there was no water left. I buried them. I buried the badge. I walked into the mountains, and I cut timber, and I did not speak to another human being beyond what the transactions required. "You can cut down every tree on a mountain," Cora said, "and not once outrun the night you weren't home." Elias looked at her. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the smoke. "I never had children," she said. "I spent my whole life thinking that meant I wasn't meant for them. I was wrong. I was the woman who was free when the children who needed her most had no one else. She turned to him. I didn't rescue those children, Elias. They rescued me. I was just as locked in that place as they were. The only difference was I had the key and they didn't. If this story is finding its way to you tonight, you're exactly the person we're telling it for. A like and a subscribe tells us to keep going. We'll keep going. Elias went to the back of the cabin, to the corner of the loft where he kept the things he did not use and could not throw away. He moved a crate. He pried up a floorboard. He brought out a leather wallet, and inside was a badge, a star, tarnished, with U.S. Marshal stamped into it, and the name Elias Thorne on the back. He had buried it the day he buried his wife. He had not touched it since. We ride for Seattle at dawn, he said. The territorial marshal's office is there. I know the man who runs it. He'll listen. And you have the ledger. It's a 2-day ride. Garrett will have men on the road. Then we take the Ridge Trail. No one uses it. And if the weather turns? Elias looked at the sky. It was clear and cold, and the stars were hard and bright. Then we go anyway. They left before dawn. Elias on a big-boned bay mare, Cora on a mule, the children in a canvas sling rig between the two animals, padded with straw and blankets. They took the Ridge Trail, a narrow track that followed the spine of the Cascades westward, through old-growth fir so thick the sun barely reached the ground. They rode all day. They stopped once, at a clearing where a spring came out of the rock. Jonah let Elias pick him up. The child put his head against Elias's shoulder and stayed there, and Elias held very still, the way a man holds something so fragile he is afraid his own strength will break it. Samuel had not spoken since the confrontation. He rode in the sling with his arm around Lily and his eyes on the trail behind them. He was 8 years old, and he had the survival instincts of a man who has been hunted, because he had been caught and returned, and he knew in his bones what returning meant. On the second evening, they came down off the ridge into the river valley. The Snoqualmie was running high and cold. They crossed at a single log bridge, a Douglas fir stripped and laid across the current, slick with spray. The mare walked it like a cat walks a fence. The mule balked. For a moment the sling swung over the water, and Jonah made a sound, not fear, but protest, as if he was tired of being afraid and had decided to be annoyed instead. They made the crossing. In the morning, they rode into Seattle. The city was small then, a milling and shipping town clustered along the waterfront, smelling of salt water and sawdust and coal smoke. Elias had not been in a town of any size in 5 years. He carried Jonah up the stairs of the federal building because the child had fallen asleep in the sling. The territorial marshal was a man named James Aldrich, 10 years older than Elias, gray at the temples, with the careful eyes of a man who has spent his career deciding who is telling the truth. He looked at Elias the way you look at a ghost, then at the badge, then at the child, then at the woman behind him carrying a leather-bound ledger. Thorne, he said, I heard you were dead. I'm not, Elias said, and neither are these children. He told the story the way he had always told stories in a courtroom, clean, direct, without ornament. The foundling home, the labor, the starvation, the ledger, the sheriff in Ellensburg, Garrett's confrontation on his porch, the 2 days. Cora gave Aldrich the ledger. He opened it and read 2 pages, and his face went hard and the tendons in his jaw stood out like ropes. He dispatched 4 deputies that afternoon, federal warrants for Silas Garrett and Sheriff David Poole. Garrett did not make it back to his farm. He was on the Valley Road, riding toward Pine Hollow to collect the sheriff, when the deputies came down the ridge and blocked the trail. The deputies had the word of a federal marshal and the evidence of a ledger in which Garrett had recorded, in his own handwriting, the names and prices of 27 children and the burial locations of the ones who had died. Silas Garrett was arrested on the road. He was handcuffed and his weapons were taken and his horse was led away, and the man who had bought and sold children like livestock was put in a room with an iron door and left there. The trial took 3 weeks. Judge Harlan Watts presided, the same judge Elias had served under, the same man who had tried to talk him out of quitting 5 years ago. Cora testified. Samuel testified, small and straight-backed in a chair too big for him, his voice steady, telling a courtroom full of strangers what had been done to him. Lily sat in the gallery with Cora's arm around her, holding the pine bird in both hands and not letting go of it the entire time. Garrett was convicted on 19 federal counts. The sheriff was convicted on 6. The foundling home was seized and shut down, and the 11 children still inside it were removed and placed with families who were inspected and monitored and who did not feed their children scraps. The community in Pine Hollow learned the truth the way small communities always learn the truth, in fragments, in whispers, in the slow recognition that they had known something was wrong and had said nothing. Some came to the cabin to apologize. Elias accepted it. He had what he needed. The territorial court granted guardianship of Samuel, Lily, and Jonah to Cora Maddox and Elias Thorne, jointly. The document was signed by Judge Watts, and when he signed it, he looked at Elias and said, "It's good to have you back, Deputy." And Elias, who had not been called that in 5 years, did not correct him. By spring, the cabin had a new room, built from timber Elias milled himself, with a window that faced east so the morning light would wake the children gently. There was a garden behind the house where Cora planted beans and peas and the kind of onions that keep through winter. Samuel was learning to swing an axe, a small one, with a handle Elias carved from hickory he had been saving for 5 years without knowing why. Lily had named every bird that came to the feeder outside the window, and she kept the pine bird on the windowsill where she could see it from her bed. She said it was watching over them. She was not wrong. Jonah, who had not spoken a word when Cora carried him out of Garrett's farm, who had been silent for months, who had curled his hands into fists and held on to nothing, Jonah spoke. Not all at once. In pieces. A word here, a word there. And then one morning at breakfast, looking at Elias with those great dark eyes, he said his first full sentence. "Papa," he said. "More." Elias set down his coffee. He looked at the child. He looked at Cora, who was standing at the stove with tears running down her face and the biggest smile he had ever seen. He looked at Samuel, who was watching him with eyes that were not hard anymore, that were just 8 years old and full of something he had not had room for until now. He looked at Lily, who was holding the pine bird and beaming. He got up. He filled Jonah's plate. He sat back down. "More," Jonah said again, just to be sure. "Always," Elias said. "A door closed long enough starts to look like a wall. It takes someone knocking to remind you it was never one." Smoke rose from the chimney of the cabin in the clearing, and the pine bird sat on the windowsill in the last light of the spring afternoon, and the door, which had been shut against the world for 5 years, stood open. Next time, we'll tell you the story of a schoolteacher who rode into a mining town to find the man who killed her brother, and discovered that the town had already buried the truth so deep that digging it up might bury her, too. Good night, everyone. We'll see you in the next one.